Welcome back to the Bunjee Venture by Stan McMurtry. We're up to chapter 5 and I've got a confession. Our little character that we meet is actually not in this chapter 5, it's in chapter 7, but he's worth waiting for. Meanwhile, there's plenty of adventures to be had. In the last chapter, do you remember Karen and Andy had arrived in their time machine and they had made sure that when it was pushed to the side by a branch that had fallen in this prehistoric forest, because a big dinosaur had stormed past them and ripped trees out and left a big gap through the forest, the time machine had been moved, and Andy had said, we've got to move the time machine back into the exact place, because if we're not careful, if we get into the time machine when it's time to go and it's not in exactly the same place, we could get back to our own house in our own time halfway through the garage wall. So they've sorted that out, they've left it camouflaged, and they're setting off. Chapter 5. It was hard going. Everywhere great gouts of earth had been pulled out of the ground, leaving deep, ragged hollows that had to be climbed down into or around. Tangled roots tugged at their clothes, and many of the mighty trunks that had to be climbed over had rough and jagged barks that scraped the skin from their knees. Nevertheless, it was a fascinating trip. The foliage was completely different to any they'd ever seen before. Small bushes grew thickly at the feet of the big trees, and from between their dark, shiny green leaves there gushed a profusion of flowers with dazzling colours. Immense clusters of pale red fruit hung from vines that twisted up and up around the tree trunks to the bright blue slit of the sky above. The thick, heady scent of the grass and pollen and flowers hung almost visibly in the air around them. The ground was still very wet and spongy, but strangely warm. Perhaps only a very thin crust of the earth had cooled at this time, Karen thought to herself, and shuddered as the thought occurred to her that maybe just a short distance below the thick, mushy carpet that she was now walking on, there bubbled the white, hot core of the earth. After 2 hours of walking, the children found themselves on the edge of a vast, rocky plain. And that's a very flat piece of rock that you look across. Not a scrap of vegetation was to be seen. The forest had ended abruptly. It was uncanny, almost as though some giant hand had shaved a few thousand acres of the ground clean. To the left and to the right of them, the edge of the forest stretched tall and true and ruler straight to the horizon. But at the front of them was this great sandy yellow flat plain. The air seemed lighter here after the heaviness of the forest. There was something terribly eerie about the place. Maybe it was the silence and complete stillness. Nothing moved. It had been quite quiet in the forest, but within the forest the lack of sound hadn't been so scary because you were protected by the trees and the warm beauty of the flowers. But now they had reached a dead place, it seemed, a place where the silence sent a prickle of fear down your spine, a bit like watching the telly in a dark room of an empty house with the sound turned off. Now, about 400 metres away, the flat yellow ground rose up sharply into a jumble of rocks which clustered around the base of a long, low hill. It reminded Andy of a rounded piece of cheese because it was full of holes, all kinds of differently shaped holes, some big, some small. "Gosh," said Andy, "have you ever seen so many caves?" Sure enough, large holes, like moon craters, were dotted around at the foot of the porous hill. Porous means holy. Andy flopped forward onto his stomach, cupped his chin in his hands and groaned loudly. A second later, a louder groan echoed back to him across the flat ground. It was so loud it made his hair stand on end with fright, and both children leapt panic-stricken behind the nearest tree. They stood with their backs to the tree, hearts pumping loudly, not daring to move. Eventually Karen popped her head timidly round the tree again and said, "I wonder what that was." Immediately a voice answered back, "I wonder what that was." Andy's shoulders relaxed and he threw his head back and laughed. "Well, aren't we a couple of scaredies?" "It's only an echo," he said. "Only an echo," yelled the echo. "Cooey," shouted Karen. "Cooey," came the answer. "Who's a big fatty?" said Andy. "Who's a big fatty?" came the echo. "Yeah," said Karen. "Yeah," said the echo. So Andy said, "Hello, Big Nose, how's your mother off for treacle pudding?" "Fine, thanks, how's yours?" came the answer. That's not an echo. The children stood in stunned silence. That was not the answer an echo was supposed to give. Karen slowly eased her way behind the tree again. Andy was just about to follow her when something made him stop. For a second, he thought he saw a tiny movement near to one of the caves in the distance. Yes, there it was again, a small splash of colour against the yellow backcloth of the hill. The tiny speck danced about from rock to rock, pale blue like faded denim. Andy rubbed his eyes and stared hard. Behind the moving object at the entrance to one of the caves, some more splashes of colour fluttered and danced, impossibly in midair. What's that dancing in midair? They jerked and pranced together, a long line, something familiar, a washing line. Yes, it was a washing line dancing. And the single moving object, a little bit more distinct now, arms, legs, waving, something about the stoop of the shoulders, that long gangly run, leaping from rock to rock, yelling, that voice. The children rushed forward. "Daddy!" they cried, "Daddy, Daddy!" Stumbling over the sandy plain, hearts in roofs of chests, tears running down their cheeks. "Daddy!" Running over the great expanse of the flat, yellow ground that never seemed to decrease in width. Pale blue denim-clad figure waving and yelling, "Get back! Get back!" What does he mean? Halfway there now, screaming blue figure, "Get back! Get back to trees!" Soft swishing sound. Flurry of giant wings, and suddenly, let's see if you can guess what's going to happen. Look at that shadow that's chasing them. Suddenly, two great clawed feet clamped painfully around their chests, here, claws, and they felt themselves plucked up into the air, stomachs plummeting downwards, hearts stuffed high in their throats, stifling the screams, and way down below they caught a glimpse of their dad, crouched down beside a rock, his head in his hands, then trees blurred by, then clouds, and then they passed out. And I'm sorry, before I read chapter 6, should we go and see Neil? Hold on. I wonder if I can undo this without breaking it. I don't know. Crikey bobbins. Right, hold on. Let me switch the camera around. There's a little chap who wants to see us. Come on then. Hey? How you doing? Oh, he's a sweetheart. He could hear me reading and he wanted to come in. So, we're at chapter 5, or chapter 6 next. And in chapter 6, we will have to see. Now, do you know the name of that creature that's gripped them? It's a pterodactyl. And I should think that pterodactyl will think that lunch has been delivered. So let's see what happens the next chapter. Bye for now. Say bye, Neil.